So today we're just going to talk about some of the learning objectives, things that you can come away with today. We're going to talk about why we are focusing on interagency collaboration, and then talk about some of those key strategies that we'll be focusing on in this presentation, which is who those essential participants are to improve and increase your collaboration, along with the importance of data, and not only just data, but sharing and collaborating with data, and then some of those specific strategies that will, in turn, enhance your collaboration with various agencies. So, our learning objectives today, like I said, Lynn is going to talk about recognizing some of those key participants. So we're going to be able to identify those stakeholders who are essential to furthering our mission of sustainable employment and positive outcomes for our students. She'll also talk about facilitating data sharing between agencies that really improves those outcomes. And where the data comes from both school teams and agencies. And then Erica's gonna bring it home with talking about those essential strategies for collaboration that really equip both school teams and our vocational rehabilitation agencies for successful collaboration. All right, so a quick overview just of why we were focused on this. So through our work in preparing our students for life after they leave our school system, life after 22, we really realized that we were working together with adult agencies, but maybe not effectively collaborating as best that we could to be this cohesive unit for those successful adult outcomes. And so we really decided that we wanted to put our time into figuring out what some of those barriers were to collaboration. And we started by creating a Life After School coalition, partnering with a couple of our local adult agencies and DRS to really discuss those barriers, be open and honest, talk about what was really preventing us from creating those sustainable positive outcomes for our students. And then we talked and worked through what successful collaboration would look like and what we needed to do together to make our partnership even more successful. And so a couple of the research and barriers that we came across was really that sometimes our programs have different goals and different funding sources. And so that was creating a barrier because our priorities weren't quite aligned. Even though the overall priority was the success of the student, those other details and priorities just weren't quite aligning. In a study from the National Longitudinal Transition Study talked about how students who have that collaboration going on between school and vocational rehabilitation counselors and those agencies in the community have a 20% higher rate of post-school employment outcomes compared to those who didn't have that collaboration. So that was a really important piece of data to look at in thinking about why this is really important work. So the other piece that we found was just that sometimes our agencies didn't have that same language and that same understanding of what we were doing, which we were also realizing was confusing our students and our families, and then made that transition from school services to adult services that much more complicated. So Lynn is gonna take over and kind of talk about those key participants that are gonna be important for planning and improving that collaboration.
Thank you, Katie. The one thing she didn't mention is the beautiful visual in the corner that you will see highlight as I move through this. So the first one is participants. So we're gonna talk about participants, data, and then strategies, so you'll know where we are because these are our 3 objectives. Isn't it beautiful? Okay, so when you think about participants, we know that many of our students have large teams, and we initially start to think, yes, I know them, they're the IEP team. And although those members may be similar, they're not necessarily always the same. So we do need to take a deeper look at specifically who we're inviting to the meeting. Obviously, the main person in the middle is the individual, and they are the student, they are the kiddo that will be getting that sustainable employment. And I love the quote, I don't know where it came from, but nothing about me without me. So they should be there at the table, and they should help facilitate as much as they can with the transition specialist what that meeting looks like, setting the agenda and bringing their ideas to the table. If the individual or student has been involved in their transition planning since 14 and a half, this should be natural for them to at least be in the room and be bringing their ideas. So obviously a very important participant. And then I'll start from the left. The Family and Care Network. We know that the family is at the IEP table, but also when we're thinking about sustainable employment and long-term, there might be other people in their circle that they want to bring. So you guys all may have done the microboards idea, that kind of idea. Who else in their life might support them through this? Whether it's siblings, cousins, whomever is in that circle can come through this participant circle. Next one is the school team members. We know who those are. And also there could be different people at the school that are not on the IEP team that can support the student. For example, we have a kiddo who's been working in the high school cafeteria for years, and that cafeteria supervisor has a lot to say and may be able to support with ideas. So thinking outside of the IEP box. DRS rep, obviously we need our connection, and they are there to start to bridge from school to VR. The transition specialist is the main point of person that would start coordinating. The VR counselor on the end of the adult agency, that they're at the table, and then obviously the employers that they work with now, or employers that have supported that student in the past that can share part of the story. And so as you see the participants, you'll see that under the bullet points, a role of many of them is data sharing. And so that's the next part that we'll talk about. We've all been in lovely meetings where we have the right people at the table, but we're just having an idea session. We're talking about how wonderful the student is, but we might not be getting to the meat and potatoes because we're not talking about data, and the data is not driving the next step. So knowing that the participants are at the table, now we need to figure out what they're talking about. And so this visual shares the two types of data that should come to the table. One is all the information about the student. This typically will come from the family and school team and whoever else knows the student longer. And then the data for the student and family should be coming from the agencies. So in whatever way they coordinate the meeting, we should have touch points on these data pieces to make sure everybody is aligned on the next steps. So just going through some of the basics, I think this kind of speaks for itself, but in terms of the student profile, if they don't know about the student, maybe what the implications of the disability are, what mobility needs might be, what type of an environment might work best for this student, what the transportation needs are, all of those things that need to set up, this is our kiddo and these are what they will need in a job. The level of independence, we've heard it over and over in the last 2 days. What does that look like, and really clearly defining that. If they need a job coach, is it full-time or part-time? If they just need check-ins, if they can work with natural supports, and what experiences they have with that. This is a biggie, number 3, the barriers to past employment. You know, many of you that are in the school environment, kids go through a variety of jobs, whether that's because we're exposing them or something didn't necessarily work or fit. So the adult agencies really have an interest in like, hey, if they did it before, what went wrong? What could we be thinking about so that we don't do the same thing again? And some of these are outside of the students' abilities and whatnot, like transportation. If that's not set up for the student in their community and they're not going to be able to get to the job, you can have the most amazing setting and they're not going to be able to get there. So thinking about that as typically a barrier. The availability of supports in the natural environment. If it's a student that really can take supervision from someone that's there, will that work? Has that worked in the past? Different environmental ideas, you know, sight, smells, like the environment, how loud it is, all of those things that might have been barriers in the past. And then individual and family priorities. Obviously, this is very important on what the strengths are, what the goals are, and how much they want to work. Sometimes this is not talked about enough because we think we're going towards the same goal, but a family might actually only want part-time employment. The student might only want part-time if they're considering keeping other benefits of SSI, or they might really need full-time because they want that job with health insurance, etc. Or, for example, if there's a student that we have who's a great worker, but he doesn't want to stay in one job over his whole day. So he actually has 3 jobs. He does 2 hours here, 2 hours there, 2 hours in another spot, which those things need to be shared so that the agencies know this is what works well. So that's the information about the student. Obviously, there's all of the things that can also get included in there, but making sure that the people coming to the table have that information ready so that we're having a data-driven dialogue. In terms of the information for the individual and family, when they get to the table with the agency, understanding what they do, what the criteria is for acceptance, what the timeline is to get supports, who the employer partners are, if they have specific types of employers that they work with. And then really, sometimes if the agency pushes into the school before graduation, to know whether that can take place. The funding is important, depending on if it's coming from a waiver or DRS, whether it's private pay, whatever that might look like. And then the different types of contracts that they hold, whether it's milestones, whether it's a supported, and depending on what level of support they might need long term. Kind of like what are they willing to do within that contract? If the family did hire a job coach, can they go and be in the environment? Do they support AT, devices, things like that? And then the timelines, how long do we have? We know that discovery lasts a certain amount of time. To have those conversations about when will fading start, what might happen if it doesn't work on the right timeline, and those kind of, in-depth conversations. So those are the types of data. And the other part that in this conversation we learned was that there's different perceptions on the language, like Katie had mentioned, in terms of, are we understanding the words the same way and having the same meaning? So specifically, one that always catches us is independence. We're like, the kid's independent, they're doing it on their own. And is that really on their own, or is there somebody at the door? Or is there somebody trailing them 3 feet for safety, which might be keeping them on task, etc. But like that understanding of what language we're using. When we talk about fading, are we really talking about fading to natural supports or completely faded? And just making sure that as you get started, when you bring the data, that you're talking about the same thing. The second part is objectivity. I think we all love to talk about our students' strengths, and they're really great at this. They do such a good job. That's not helpful. It really needs to be, what are the facts and details? So when I say that they're great at this, I mean they organize all of these shelves, they do this, they do that. They can work independently for 20 minutes or whatever it is, they work for a long time. So just to be very specific so that conversation, there's no loss in translation. With some of the language pieces. All right, we're on our next circle, strategies for Erica.
Lynn talks a mile a minute. So now we're going to go into some of the strategies that hopefully you can use to increase interagency collaboration, and just some things that we have done that was really successful. So the first thing we're going to dive into is really setting the stage with communication strategies. And these aren't necessarily like best practices for schools, but it's just best practice for how you might communicate with any person. So establishing those clear communication channels, open, candid, the types of how you communicate with the shared documents, avoiding misinterpretations. I think one thing that came out of that conversation with the coalition that we have been meeting with, the 2 adult agencies, we had to have a very candid conversation with one of them, because we were sharing that some families have these preconceived notions about the type of individuals that they support. And we've had some families say, oh, well, my kid's not high enough to work with that agency. And, you know, there was just some misconception. So us being candid, and that was like a hard conversation that we had with them, it really helped them realize, oh, maybe we have to market ourselves more accurately. Like, how can we better make sure we are providing supports to all students and all individuals, inclusive and respectful language. You know, there's different cultures and terminology depending on school versus adult agency, and also language that is accessible to all, especially avoiding like school jargon. So a lot of agencies are really good at knowing what the jargon is, but some are like, wait a minute, what is that? You know, some people might not be comfortable asking those questions. Adapting communication styles as needed, tailoring the message, visual aids. I find I'm a very visual learner, so I'm like, how can I make that into like a visual timeline of supports that from the information that our agencies provide us. And then I start the feedback loops between school and agency teams, and I think this is kind of the work that we want to do ongoing. So this is where our meetings with the rehab agencies was key. We kind of jumped in with the reflection, like Katie said, understanding what were some really good success stories, what were some barriers, and then we each stepped away from that first initial meeting with like, this is our goal together, is to understand each other better and the systems and the processes. And then we each came away with our own action items of how we can better support families to understand information about the adult world. And then we kind of committed to continuing to loop back in with each other so that we're making sure that we're staying relevant and that we're staying on top of any changes that might come up. So again, relationship-focused strategies. As we know, relationships we make as staff and school personnel can significantly impact our students and their futures. So building that trust and respect. You know, partnership goes two ways. So getting to know each other, what are their vision, their mission. We completely believe in our vision and our mission. You know, we're committed to the possibilities of every learner every day. And that is really important to us as an organization. So making sure that the agencies we work with know that about us. I think that accountability and integrity is very important. Following through on certain commitments, holding yourself accountable for the things that you said you would do. And then that practicing collaboration and compromise, engaging in the problem solving, being open to different perspectives. I think that's, Katie and I were talking, we were so excited to come to this because we love learning new things, and like you can't just stay in the same, oh, well, this is what we do. So that feedback loop and those meetings with that coalition was really important for us to change our practices, because we're like, oh my gosh, no, we were doing that totally wrong, or we totally didn't understand what that meant in the adult world. So the next area that we're going to talk about is some joint engagement strategies. So one thing that is important is the cross-training and professional learning, making sure, you know, we utilize each other to learn. Joint advocacy and awareness, so public outreach to increase employment opportunities. How do you showcase collaboration? We had an employer recognition breakfast, so we recognize our employers, and that's like a perfect way to connect with adult agencies and just keep showcasing the success that we have. And then transition planning meetings is one of our successful collaboration tools. We spoke on this last year more in depth, but we wanted to continue to highlight this as a strategy we employ to engage not only with families, students, and teams, which is kind of what our spin was last year about this topic, but also how do we engage in meaningful ways with the adult agencies within these transition planning meetings. So I'm going to go over a little bit more generally, quicker than we did last year, but as a reminder, these transition planning meetings are informal. They're outside of the IEP. Key members have to include, especially in that last year or year and a half, at the latest, the 6 months or like the December, January before they graduate in June, those adult agencies like DRS. We have a DRS STEP grant, so we have somebody that comes to those every single TPM in the last school year of before the student graduates. That DRS representative is key. And then the goal is to support families. It's our goal then to have families learn more about DRS and different contracts and set up meetings we have probably 5 main agencies that work with our students in our northern suburbs of Chicago area, and making sure we're having our student and family meet with those agencies to get to know, what they provide and what they can support them with and the specificity of the contracts, because they are the customer. They have a say in how they're getting the support in the future. So just focusing on that future plan, and a lot of times instead of covering all 4 areas of the transition plan, as it says, focused on the future plan, we many times, if employment is the biggest outcome of all, we will have just employment-based transition planning meetings where the whole agenda is based on just employment. And we might touch on some other ancillary things, but that's a big one in the last year, especially when you're crossing over. So these meetings are consistent. Participants know what to expect. The key is, again, that increased opportunity for agency participation and overlap. We talk about that overlap as being so important for our families to feel comfortable so it doesn't feel like the cliff. Yes. So I think there's a change also with the collaboration and including different adult agencies in these meetings. In the first couple years of transition, or if we get a student who just has a couple years with us, when their age is 18 to about 20, 21, including adult agencies is less frequent. It's more to inform families, it's more to inform students, so they can hear information about incoming students, because I know that is helpful too, for agencies to learn what's coming up, what are the priorities of the students that are gonna access our services after they graduate. That's helpful for them to know. And then towards the end, so again, that last year, that last 6 months at the latest, we have very frequent transition planning meetings. They are monthly, or with one family, I think we were meeting every 2 weeks. It was a very small group and it was quick, but it was a good touch point. And those adult agencies came to a lot of those transition planning meetings. We felt it was less formal than an IEP. In an IEP, you have to get through what you have to get through. You have to get through the present levels and the services and the placement. And some of that is not necessarily helpful for adult agencies. So while it's, yes, good for them to be at the IEP, some of these more informal conversations, sharing that data that Lynn mentioned is very important. And then we facilitate that handoff from school services to adult services. So this talks about, an agenda is really important We send an agenda ahead of time to everybody that's coming. And I think for adult agencies that maybe don't go to a lot of school meetings as much, this really helps with that joint engagement. So everybody knows what to expect. So the agency knows what information they have to bring to the table. Oh, I have this really great visual, or I should bring this folder, or I should bring like my intake notes because we're going to talk about the data about the student. And I don't have to call again to do an interview with the parent or do an interview with the student because I'm getting the same information. Teaming, we talked about those relationship strategies, those communication strategies that are just best practice for any team, no matter if it's in the schools or if it's in any other area of our lives. And then again, shared notes and those action items. So that talks about, the accountability, identifying what the action item is, what is the timeline or the due date, because you're in crunch time. It's the last year or 6 months or 2 months, or now for one student, she just got connected to an agency and she's graduating in a month and a half. Those action items with specific timelines and specific people attached to those action items has shown a lot of success for us. And, we send out the notes as an attachment, but put those action items right in the body of the email. So for those people who are like, oh, I was there, I don't need to look at the notes. No, the action items are right there, and it's a reminder to hold teams accountable. And our notes typically have the date, the attendees, the agenda, any associated outcome goals or IEP goals. And we also have a section in our notes that is that assessment or data information. We try and put which assessment was done so that maybe the adult agency could be like, oh, you did the employability and life skills assessment over the last 4 years. Can we have that longitudinal data from when they were 18, 19, 20, 21? So they have specific information, and again, action items. And of course, nothing about me without me. Student and parent input should be reflected. Their voice should be probably the majority of what the notes contain. These are just a couple examples of what our notes look like. Of course, with the information up top, we email out the agenda just in a body of an email. What their employment outcome goals are. I think that increases clarity, especially for adult agencies. If there's, if that adult outcome should be very specific, especially in that last IEP about where they want to work or what their interest level is or what the career cluster of interest is, so that it's up front and center. Especially some of those student preferences that Lynn mentioned, like if they want to work full-time or part-time, what their schedule preferences are. So that is just very clear about what the end goal is. It increases clarity, and it makes sure everybody is remembering what the goal is. And again, we have the assessment information, notes. It just really, the way we've structured it increases efficiency and effectiveness, but also I think the adult agencies then get a really good snapshot in just the way we've structured it, and they're an equal member of those meetings. We just whipped through. So in closing, the key participants, the sharing of data, and the collaboration is really important to lead to those sustainable employment outcomes, and partnering and spending time. It seems like a lot of time. I think that was one bit of feedback we get from some people, is like, well, you meet that frequently? Oh, how does the adult agency, it just has to be a commitment. And I think Lynn and Katie, being administrators in our district and our program, they've really saw how important this work is, and they support the amount of time that we put into it. And, you know, we're not working directly with our students when we meet with adult agencies for, you know, we've had a couple 2-hour meetings, which 2 hours, it was a lot, we're cutting down, especially to be more efficient, but really taking the time at the front end, I feel like has helped us this year, and we've been able to make really quick changes and updates to our practices. Like we were able to produce this vocab chart based on the feedback that we got from adult agencies. So this is what the vocabulary is in school, like the 1-to-1 aid or the 0.5 aid is the job coach in adult. Like, it's stuff that we feel like we know, but families may not. And just comparing what vocabulary we use in schools and what that word is, if it's different in the adult world, and maybe what are the differences in that. So we were able to really make some good visuals, or even, like I said, a timeline visual of what that process is. Because so many of our families, they hear all of this information and they have to hear it 5, 6, 7, 8 times. I know I had to hear it a number of times before it really stuck. So just some of those easy things that we can implement and then loop back with each other. We've met maybe every 6 weeks this year, and it's really helped with implementing some easy changes and some supports. And even taking some work off of our back, like, oh, you don't need that information? Great, we won't put that together for the summary of performance then, because if you're not even gonna look at it, we won't do it. And that's the rest of our presentation. We put in just a QR code link, just some stories from TrueNorth, and just if you're interested in our district. And again, like I said, we are committed to the possibilities of every learner every day. We have a wide variety of students that have significant support needs, to students that are gonna get full-time paid employment super quick. They just need some support kind of getting there, or like some sort of gap year. So thank you.